Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thanks to our online audience as well. I know we have quite a number of individuals who are registered online. My name is Sarah Parshall-Perry, and I am not only a senior legal fellow here, I'm former senior counsel to the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. So I have, as the saying goes, some skin in this game. Sunday, we mark the passage of the 52nd anniversary of Title IX, the federal law guaranteeing sex equality in all federally funded education programs. Title IX leveled the playing field for girls and women, has increased women's athletic participation in scholastic sports by over 10 times. It has increased women's participation in graduate programs, increased college enrollments, and was hailed by the feminist movement at the time of its passage in 1972 as a triumph. But in a painful twist of irony, that same law that once provided a platform for female advancement and equality is set to be sacrificed to President Biden's radical political agenda under the guise of equity and transgender rights. In addition to removing common sense due process protections for those accused of sexual assault on campus, the rule imperils the safety and privacy of girls, imposes an unconstitutional speech code on teachers and students, and violates parental rights. The consequences of this new rule are virtually limitless and create countless inconsistencies with Title IX's text, congressional history, and long-standing regulations. The President and the Department of Education do not have the power to unilaterally rewrite the law that Congress passed by way of some bureaucratic cudgel or executive fiat, but that hasn't prevented them from trying. With an impending enforcement date of August 1st, state officials, parents, thought leaders, and litigators are pushing back. You will hear from many of those individuals today. Before we kick off our first portion of the program, I'd like you to turn your attention to the screen for some remarks from Florida Governor Ron DeSantis.
Hello to the Heritage Foundation. Joe Biden is waging a war against our society. He's violating the Constitution, and he's taking aim at truth itself when he tries to impose gender ideology on our society and, in particular, our education system. What he's trying to do with Title IX is unconstitutional. He does not have the authority to rewrite the law so that he, through the Department of Education, can impose these new rules that would impose gender ideology on our education system. In the state of Florida, we've said very simply, our response is this: we will not comply. And we should not comply with unconstitutional dictates. We also should not comply with things that'll be harmful for our society. What Biden's doing is very, very troubling from a constitutional perspective. He's violating his oath of office, whether it's what he's doing at the border, what he's done on student loans, what he's doing on Title IX. And we all have a responsibility to uphold the Constitution, whether we're in office or not. And so we will do that. But this issue of gender ideology is even beyond that, because is our society going to be rooted in truth, or are we basically going to twist in the wind and go with ever direction the latest ideological fad wants to take us? And in Florida, we've said very clearly and put deeds behind our words that we will be rooted in truth. We're one of the first states to protect the integrity of women's sports. How is it fair to be injecting a male athlete into women's competitions and then the male athlete wins the trophies or wins the championship? What a fraud. We also ensured in our K-12 system that we would not have gender ideology imposed in the classroom, particularly for our young students. It is wrong to teach a kindergartner that they were born in the wrong body. It's wrong to tell a second grader that their gender is a choice. Now, when we took that position, we ended up having some pretty high-profile opposition to that, including our most high-profile and powerful company in the modern history of our state. And a lot of people, even on the right, were trying to say that it was wrong to go toe-to-toe with a private business when it comes to things like gender ideology. But we knew we had to stand up for parents, we knew we had to stand up for kids, and what we did was not only right, what we have done has been upheld. We had to respond against Disney by making sure that they didn't have any special privileges, because we didn't want to be in a situation where we were subsidizing gender ideology activism. And so we were able to do that successfully. And so we stood our ground, we did the right thing, and we won every step of the way. So this is something that is fundamental. Our society is not going to succeed if we allow the education system to tell our young people that their gender is a choice. We've done something about it in the state of Florida. We're going to fight the Biden administration on what they're trying to do from the federal level, and I appreciate everything that you're doing at Heritage and throughout the country to stand up for the truth, to stand up for what is right, and to stand up for our Constitution. Thank you all. God bless, and keep up the fight.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today at this incredibly important event with so many wonderful speakers who are on the front lines fighting this radical takeover by the Biden administration. I'm Lindsay Burke. I direct our Center for Education Policy here at the Heritage Foundation, and it is my pleasure today to be able to moderate a panel with some fantastic state leaders and a student athlete, former student athlete, and the Commissioner of Florida, Manny Diaz. So let me introduce them first, and then you can walk up after that and take your seat. Commissioner Manny Diaz is a lifelong educator, having begun his career in education teaching social studies and coaching baseball in the Miami-Dade County Public School System in 1994. He then served as an assistant principal until 2013, becoming Chief Operating Officer at Doral College. He was appointed Commissioner of Education by the Florida State Board of Education on June 1st, 2022. Prior to becoming Commissioner of Education, Diaz served with distinction in the Florida legislature, originally elected to the Florida House of Representatives in 2012, where he quickly became known as an expert and champion of education freedom. During his tenure in the Florida House of Representatives, he served as chairman of both the Education Choice and Innovation Committee and the Pre-K Appropriations Subcommittee. In 2018, he was elected to the Florida State Senate, where he served as chairman of the Education Committee. We also welcome today Paula Scanlon, an ambassador at Independent Women's Forum and Independent Women's Voice, where she works to defend women's single-sex spaces and stand up for the right to free speech. Scanlon graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, where she studied computer science and swam for the school's prestigious NCAA Division I swim team. Paula was the only female athlete at UPenn's engineering school in the class of 2022 and is a phenomenal athlete, breaking the New England Independent School League record in March 2017 for the 400-yard freestyle relay. Inspired by fellow female athletes, Paula broke her silence in June 2023 on her experience as a teammate of Leah Thomas and the efforts of her college's administration and student body to silence her and suppress her right to free speech. We're also joined today by Tiffany Justice, who is the co-founder of Moms for Liberty, a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization fighting for the survival of America by unifying, educating, and empowering parents to defend their parental rights at all levels of government. Founded in January 2021, Moms for Liberty currently has 275 chapters in 44 states with over 115,000 active members. Tiffany is a wife and mom of 4 school-age children. In 2016, she stepped up to serve for 4 years on the school district of Indian River County, Florida School Board. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. Welcome, everyone. It is a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you all in advance for being so courageous in this fight that is so existential to America's families. So I want to start with Commissioner Diaz. I think just to frame the conversation today, it would be helpful to hear from you. You wrote a memo, a letter in April that the, quote, the new rules, the Biden administration's Title IX rules, would force the state to violate federal and state laws, including the First Amendment, the Parental Rights and Education Act, and statutes that protect students' privacy in locker rooms and bathrooms. Can you walk us through what your letter meant, why you believe it would do that?
Yes, and thank you for having me. Thank you to Heritage. And as you heard clearly from our governor in Florida, we made a decision very quickly that we were not going to allow this infringement from the federal government into our state. It violates state sovereignty, and on so many levels is so wrong. And so the memo, you know, the federal government tries to bully, especially bully our school districts, and there is a lot. They get nervous, and so I wanted to make it extremely clear that from the state level, we were going to put a stop to this, and we were going to send a clear message that we're not complying with this unconstitutional rule by unelected bureaucrats trying to change an act of Congress. First level, obviously, a violation of the Constitution and the First Amendment. If you look at this rule, what it does is in the space of sexual harassment, by simply misgendering somebody, by saying something that could very well happen in a classroom to a teacher or to anyone, you fall into the trap that now that person could be guilty of sexual harassment, which is designed to protect people where there's a real problem. And now you are imposing that on everyone, especially in the education space, where just misgendering would create that issues. To top that off, in Florida, we passed several pieces of legislation, starting by the Women's Sports Act, to protect our women and girls, where it clearly states in our statute that sports in Florida, can only participate by your biological sex, not by what you're pretending to be, because we're going to preserve the truth. Other state statutes were also passed to protect bathrooms and locker room spaces and the privacy of women and girls. And so this rule is basically putting our schools in a situation where they were going to have to violate state statute. It also violates our parents' rights legislation and act, where you have the protection of forcing teachers to use pronouns that violate their own beliefs, and creates a situation in the classroom that, again, starts to impose on our students things that are not true. And so in order to preserve all of that, we felt that it was important that we immediately clearly communicated to our schools that we're not going to implement this, hold back. And of course, we went ahead and filed a lawsuit along with other states. Ours was in one of the federal districts in Alabama, and we are expecting shortly here, hopefully this month in July, to hear of a positive action on an injunction on that.
We heard earlier this morning from Attorney General Liz Murrill. She had filed hers 13 minutes after midnight, so that they were pretty fast on that, but you were close behind. So thank you for your leadership on that. Let me jump to Tiffany next. So the Biden administration's rewrite stretches all the way down, as Commissioner Diaz mentioned, into K-12 schools, forcing minor girls to share any previously single-sex facility with biological males. That is what we're talking about here. As the Independent Women's Forum, Inez Stepman, has written, the rewrite, quote, is twisting a women's right to statute into a weapon to take away girls' privacy, opportunities, and safety. So what are you hearing from the thousands of moms, the thousands of members across the country about how they see it affecting their families?
So I'm going to have to start with a fact check, because we have 315 chapters
You might fact check me on
in
that.
48 states with over 130,000 members at Moms for Liberty. So we certainly have nationwide reach. That was an important part of the lawsuit that we did file against the Biden administration, represented by Southeastern Legal Foundation. I think you'll hear from Kim a little bit later today. Moms and dads are horrified. Americans are in general. This is a ridiculous, where did this come from? All of a sudden, this is normal, that you're going to tell kindergarten students that they may have been born in the wrong body? These are children that believe in Santa Claus. And I happen to think that more Americans would be upset about or aware of if teachers were going and telling kids that Santa wasn't real in kindergarten. And yet somehow this can be taught in the classroom. And so moms and dads are taking a stand. It's, really hard for us it's frustrating sometimes because you wonder how bad is it going to have to get in order for people to stand up and say something. And unfortunately, we have reached this, low, where you have, women like Paula that are forced to be with biological males in the locker room. And we have one of our plaintiffs in the lawsuit is a mom whose daughter has compulsory swim classes at school. She's going to have a boy in the girls' locker room changing with her. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. And so the thing I think parents need to understand and what we've seen is that nothing protects your children from this. It doesn't matter whether they're in public or private school. It's in all the schools. It doesn't matter what color your skin is, what religion you practice, how much money you have. This is a real effort to drive a wedge between the parent and the child. And moms and dads are calling it out and saying, no more, this is the line. And so, we're just thankful for the 4 moms that were willing to stand up in this lawsuit. And, no masks like all these coward protesters across the United States, right, that want to hide their identity while they virtue signal. These moms are standing up, they're speaking out, they're showing their faces, their children's initials are in the complaints, and they are representing moms and dads across the country. So they're angry about what the Biden administration is doing, but we don't waste a lot of time being angry. We get to work at Moms for Liberty.
That's great. Well, the Santa Claus analogy is helpful too. A few people have made the point that this expects a 12-year-old to be able to change their gender, but the administration doesn't expect an 18-year-old or a 20-year-old to be able to repay their student loans and understand that. So. So Paula, let's turn to your story. You've had the most personal experience with what this has meant. Can you walk us through that? You were going about your life focused on being just a stellar student athlete at one of the premier universities in the country, and all of that changed in an instant for you when Leah Thomas was placed on the UPenn swim team. So can you tell us what that was like? What did it mean for you on a day-to-day basis? What did it mean for you emotionally? What did it mean for you as a competitor? Walk us through that.
Absolutely. I mean, the best way to explain it is just unimaginable. When it was first announced to us, it was a really brief meeting. He sat before our entire women's team and said, "Hi guys, I'm transgender. Please call me she, her. I'm coming to your team soon." And that was it. And the meeting was over. And I was waiting for the moment where someone was going to come out with the candid cameras and say, "Pranked ya." But, it never happened. And obviously, he went on to actually join our team. And upon doing that, quickly, he was posting top times in the nation in every event he swam. He broke all of our team records in every event that he swam. He eventually went on to win an NCAA championship. By the way, we've never had someone make finals at the NCAA championship, let alone win it all outright. So it was a crazy, it took our program from having essentially never scored points to being a top 20 program in the nation with one athlete. And so it was that part was super jarring and expected, but what was unexpected is the lack of conversations. As soon as we started raising concerns, they sent administrators from the athletic department and the LGBT center and counseling to sit us down, and they told us that we were bigoted and hateful for objecting. They told us we would never be able to find a job if we spoke out against this. They also compared it to the next civil rights movement. They said this is going to be equivalent to discriminating against people based on race. This is the new movement, and you have to get on board. And it was incredibly effective. I mean, most of my teammates that I could at least have one-on-one conversations with prior, they stopped engaging in those conversations. And again, they had regular follow-up meetings with us, with the LGBT Center telling us that, again, it's about being inclusive and supportive, and if we don't comply, we will contribute to somebody committing suicide. That's emotional blackmail, telling 18 to 22-year-old girls that they'll kill somebody if they simply say, "I'm not comfortable undressing in a locker room with a man." And again, those are the tactics they used at my school, but also all the other Ivy League schools that were racing against us. Other schools in the NCAA that were facing Thomas at the NCAA championship. And this just continued to go on. And I think one of the scariest things that they said to us was, they said, "Here, if you continue to object this, there's nothing you can do about it. But if you continue to object, please seek therapy. And they gave us the number for psychological services. And they said, you need therapy because you are a hateful person and you need to be re-educated. And again, it really brought me to just realize again how far these institutions are willing to go to censor us, and that it's so much further than just sports, because of course the sports part was unfair, but they were emotionally manipulating us girls. They were convincing us to not trust our own instincts, and I think that's the most dangerous part, is now you're teaching girls that if a man enters their locker room, that if you object to it somehow, you are the problem and you need help. That puts girls into very dangerous situations, and I think that's really what was so scary about it. And again, the worst part is we had to undress with him in the locker room 18 times every single week. We have 9 practices, you change in, change out. It was just completely crazy, and I think I don't even think I was even processing it until after I was well into doing it, how traumatizing it was. I mean, hearing a man's voice in the background behind you when you're undressing, and you jump up for a moment and you realize, oh wait, actually this person is supposed to be there. Again, what I was saying, like they're training our instincts to change, and that is really what's so dangerous, and especially when it comes to younger girls that are being put through this, because us as 18 and ups, it's a little bit different, but when you see these really young girls being forced in these situations, I think that's what scares me the most, and that's really why I spoke out to begin with. It's really about the next generation of athletes and young girls that are being put into dangerous situations, and again, that's why this issue is so important. It's about protecting the next generation.
Well, thank you for your courage and leadership. I know you had so much to lose in speaking out, so thank you. Commissioner Diaz, let me just sort of piggyback off what Paula was saying. You recently wrote that the Biden administration, this is a great quote, maims the statute beyond recognition in an attempt to gaslight the country into believing that biological sex no longer has any meaning. Well said. So can you delve a little deeper into how you're specifically protecting women and girls when it comes to sports and locker rooms and everything that Paula just articulated?
Yeah, and I mean, it's disturbing, and just listening to Paula, that this is so dystopian, and this is so familiar, right? Such a Marxist coercion to try to twist the truth and try to change the truth. And so, as I mentioned before, we passed legislation, number one, to protect women's sports, not allowing this to happen in Florida. And I'll start with a recent case where we had to enforce it. We had a high school in South Florida where, unfortunately, the mom was involved at an early age to change the records of a child, and she was a district employee. And we had to actually enforce, because the student athlete participated on a women's team, and we had to go in and have our athletics association sanction the school with heavy penalties. They're on probation where they could lose their ability to, if they violate again, lose their ability to participate in sports in our state, and ended up taking action against and investigating, taking action against the certificates of individuals who participated and allowed this to happen despite the law. So number one, I want to highlight the enforcement, because I think you can have all these things, but if you're not willing to go in and actually enforce it, and of course you're going to have all these critics saying you're taking the ability of students to participate. What you're doing is taking the ability of girls to be able to participate in their sports, taking a slot, taking away the ability for opportunities for scholarships in these sports. The other thing is the issue of the locker rooms and the bathrooms. And this started in Florida actually probably as early as 2015, and it didn't pass at that point because many people believed that it was a solution in search of a problem. They were wrong. The legislator brought that forward was completely seeing what was developing, and we have seen, unfortunately, we were able to get that passed. And how do we do that? We make sure that all of our institutions, including, and I have not only the K-12, but I oversee the state colleges, and I sit on the board of governors for the universities. So we have implemented this to protect those spaces. So in Florida, no man can pretend to be a woman and go into these locker rooms, go into these bathrooms, and we are protecting our girls and our women. But with the parental rights bill and the issue of the pronouns, we've also prevented that to enter into the classroom, where you have folks pushing from the other side to say that teachers have to be forced to use a pronoun that doesn't align with the biological sex of students in that classroom. And what happens is some individuals have said, well, if that person wants to be called that, then you should do it. You're infringing on their rights. Well, the problem is you have a classroom full of other children. And imagine having an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old or a 5-year-old hear that and all of a sudden start to ask those questions. And so that would rob our students, our children, of their innocence. And again, we fall back to our principles, and the leadership of our governor is we're going to protect that. We're going to protect truth. And if parents want to have that conversation, want to deal with that at home, it is the right of a parent to do. But those conversations should not be forced upon innocent children, as well as we should not be forcing these issues, these terrible situations on our girls or our women college athletes. And so that's what we've done. And unfortunately, we had to enforce it, but we've shown we are very willing to enforce it, and we will continue to protect girls and women in the state of Florida.
That's great. Well, Tiffany, let's kind of go off of what the commissioner was just saying when it comes to misgendering, right? So the rule defines treating someone according to their biological sex as discrimination, potentially encouraging schools to punish even these minor infractions, students who misgender a fellow student. Are schools being upfront with parents right now about what's at stake? I'm thinking in particular about California, which just passed a law prohibiting schools from disclosing to parents if their child is going by a different name or pronoun. So how are you working to restore accountability from schools to parents?
Well, Moms for Liberty works to restore accountability by holding people accountable, by showing up to your school board, by talking and building relationships with school board members. Again, I want to be clear, and I think this is airing on C-SPAN, so hello, America. I think it's important for people to understand this is actually happening in our public schools. There are secret conversations that are happening between adults and children, sanctioned by the government. The United States government is encouraging schools to have secrets, adults keeping secrets from parents about their children. It is absolutely the biggest, largest betrayal of trust that we could have possibly thought of, that you send your child to a school hoping that they'll learn to read, write, and do math. And make no mistake, that's what American parents still want from their public schools, and that somehow your child might express mental distress in that school, and the school, rather than coming to you and saying, hey, mom and dad, we know you love your child more than anyone else in this world. Instead of coming to them and saying, we need your help, we need to make you aware of something, they're going to take that child now and fill out 6 pages of forms where that child decides what name they're going to use at school, and then what name the school's going to use when they call you. They even have plans for when you have a sibling at the school. How are you going to handle that? How will you keep that a secret from the parents or the sibling even? The largest betrayal of trust, Lindsay, and it has to absolutely stop. So we believe this is an awareness issue. Every time we're looking at polling, even in people in different counties in Florida, we have Title IX resolutions being passed, and we're looking at people who have no party affiliation. And we're seeing 90% plus of those people are with us. These are people who are normally split 50-50 on issues in any given place. And so the American public are with us, but they need to understand that there is a wedge being driven between the parent and the child in our public schools, that the Biden administration and the federal government is encouraging this to happen, and that there are doctors in America and the American Medical Association and American Academy of Pediatrics that are supportive of cutting off the healthy body parts of children. And I just want to make this last point. This idea, oh, what's the big deal? We're just going to use the pronouns they want. This idea that social transition isn't a big deal. It's a huge deal. It is the first step on a path that it becomes incredibly difficult to get out of, and the kids get sucked in. And I'll give you an analogy that I come back to just as a human being. When I was 12 years old, I decided I was going to be a vegetarian. I told everybody, I'm going to be a vegetarian, I'm not going to eat meat anymore. 6 months later, I decided I didn't really want to be a vegetarian. And it was kind of embarrassing to eat a hamburger. I would just still remember and be like, well, I'm not a vegetarian anymore. I know that sounds silly. Now imagine you're 12 years old and you tell everybody, I was born in the wrong body. I think I have my thought process, who I think I am. I was born in the wrong body, and I think I'm really a boy. How do you walk that back as a teenager, especially after you've been love bombed at school and now you have these special relationships? Often these children are kids who are vulnerable, who need extra support, who are artistic, who we should be pouring into, right? And so we're just at a moment right now where the truth and awareness is incredibly important, and that's what Moms for Liberty is trying to do. We are trying to tell every person that will listen how incredibly harmful this toxic gender ideology is, and we are going to call out the Biden administration and the federal government at every turn, and specifically Miguel Cardona, who, my goodness, may be the worst Secretary of Education we have ever had in the United States of America, violating the rights of parents. How dare he?
Paula, you have written publicly about being a survivor of sexual assault. With that as background, how did that affect you, having to share a locker room with a biological male?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly how you would expect. I mean, it's not comfortable to undress with males if you don't have that history. But I think for me, it was what really showed me how damaging this was, because you're inviting women to be undressing with males. And I think that's something I talk about a lot. And it's so interesting because the left has pushed this whole Me Too, believe all women. And since I shared this, I cannot express to you how many leftist activists have commented saying, "I don't believe you, you're a liar." And it shows me again how far we've come in this country, that it's truly about these men who are entitled, that believe something that's false, and it's all about them, and we've left behind all the women. And there have been plenty of other women, even some on the left, that have come out and said that they support me and they understand why I feel the way that I do, and they wouldn't want to share a locker room with a man. They wouldn't want their daughters to share a locker room with a man. And all of those voices are ignored to accommodate for these men who are confused and just want to change in front of women. And I think the craziest part, we're talking about how I think it's mentioned earlier that Title IX now is having something where if you misgender somebody, you could be charged with sexual harassment by your university. My question to these administrators of the university: how is a 6'4" tall man, fully intact with male parts, flashing himself to my teammates 18 times a week? Not sexual harassment, but if I call him a him, I'm the harasser. And so, again, that's really what it showed me at every single stage of this, that, again, they've basically made this pyramid of hierarchy, and for some reason, whatever reason, men who identify as women are on the top of it, and everybody else doesn't matter. And people are like, "Oh, that's so dramatic," but it really is true, because, again, time and time again, there was 35 other girls on my team as well, and every single one of us was told to step aside and make the one man in the room comfortable. I don't understand how we've gone so far with all this feminist and all the Me Too movements and all these different things, that we've gone so far that it's not even about women anymore. It's about making men comfortable. And I think that is really what woke me up. And I think because of my past and my history, I think that's really why I probably woke up sooner than maybe some of the other people around me. But again, it shouldn't even take a history of assault for you to feel uncomfortable. And I think I want to make that very clear, that there's no woman, whatever her background, whatever her history, whatever anything she's been through in her life, that should want to, and be subjected to doing that. And I think that's really why this is so important. And again, interestingly, I mean, we traveled to other meets in other locations, and there were younger girls in these locker rooms sometimes that were exposed to undressing with this 6'4" tall man. So I think that's also part of the problem, that we're just, people's parents aren't even aware that this is happening. I don't think their parents knew. And I think that's why, again, we have to stop this. We have to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone. We have to make sure that there are rules in place. And again, there are people enforcing the rules, right? That's what's so necessary here. And also, if you're a father and you find out this is happening to your daughter, make a fuss. Go in that locker room and make some noise. Like, get them out of there. I mean, I think that's really what it takes, and it's unfortunately, we can't afford to be quiet anymore.
I'm so glad you're here today, because that story really illustrates so much can get lost in the 1,500-page rule. It's technical, and so to hear you make it so concrete, unfortunately, your experience being able to make it so concrete is just incredibly important. So thank you for being willing to tell that story. Commissioner Diaz, Florida is back-to-back champion on our Heritage Foundation Center for Education Freedom report card. For education freedom, you've taken first place now 2 years in a row. That is to say, when it comes to K-12 education, Florida is responsive to parents, not special interest groups. So what have you heard when you're talking to parents on this issue of Title IX, and how do you respond to them? When you hear stories like you've just heard from Paula, how are you talking to them and responding to them?
Well, first, I'd like to acknowledge that, we have a banner at the lobby of the Department of Education with that back-to-back #1, and we thank Heritage. But I like to thank Heritage and all of the leaders that are here, and all of those female athletes and others who are willing to give the testimony, because this is important. Because what the Biden administration will tell you is, no, there's nothing here, there's nothing in this report. No, we're not really doing this. And the truth is that they're pushing this agenda with coercion and intimidation. We've heard from parents starting, but I'm the father of 3 girls, starting at home from my wife. They're terrified of all the things all the stories they're seeing and all the changes that are going. There's enough pressure on our youth. There's enough pressure on our girls with social media and all the other aspects that are in society. This is terrifying to parents, and that's what they're telling us. And everywhere that I go across the state, I have people come up to me and thank me and thank the administration and thank our legislature for being able to stand in the breach and say that we are going to put our flag down and we are going to protect our girls and we're going to protect the truth in our state. And so what I continue to tell them is that they can count on us to take those arrows up front. They can certainly count on our governor, Ron DeSantis, to take those to take that incoming fire. But it is important that they get involved. Just like Tiffany talks about the movement with Moms for Liberty, we need to continue to have moms that are aware of these situations and what is going on and what this agenda is, and show up at school board meetings and show up at the legislature and show up everywhere that decisions are being made to voice complete opposition to it. Because sometimes there are elected officials that lack courage. And the problem is that the only way you can get them to act is by showing them that there's a movement out there. And so it is important that we share these stories and that we have moms and that we have dads show up at these meetings and make sure we communicate. So what I tell them is, look, you can count on us. We're going to continue to fight this fight. Our governor's going to continue to fight this fight. But we need you to be vocal. We need you to show up and to continue to send that message that this is not going to be tolerated. This is an extreme danger to our country and to our republic. And it is incredible that we have folks that are now becoming active thanks to these efforts, like the ones by Heritage, like Moms for Liberty, like the testimony that we hear from Paula here. It is incredible that we do have people waking up and coming out and putting efforts into it. So my advice is continue to do that because we need you there.
Well, thank you. Look, no state income tax, beautiful weather. You're protecting women and girls. I mean, it's tough not to move to Florida. So thank you for your leadership. Tiffany, one more question to you. So under your leadership, Moms for Liberty just filed a lawsuit to stop this Title IX rewrite from taking effect and gutting parental rights in K-12 education. Can you tell us a little more about that suit? How do you see this all playing out? And why is this fight so important to Moms for Liberty?
Yeah, the preliminary injunction for the hearing is happening right now, so I'm sure, I think Kim Herman is on a panel, and she's going to share a little bit more about that, so that's exciting. Just really incredible to have the Southeastern Legal Foundation work with us and help us to bring this suit against the Biden administration. We're in a scary time in America where people don't know, if I take a stand, what's going to happen, but Moms for Liberty, because we unify people, we educate them on the issues, they feel very empowered to make change happen, and so just very thankful to be a part of it, to have the opportunity to have moms that can stand in defense of the First Amendment and their children being able to tell the truth at school and to not have to pretend that a boy is a girl. I want to share, I mentioned the resolution. I just want to get to this before we end. A call to action for parents. If you go to momsforliberty.org, there's a Title IX resource page. You can see all of the lawsuits that have been filed. You can see the actual rule changes. You can and a fact sheet about it. What you'll also see are some calls to action for you. the Title IX resolution that I spoke of, there's model policy. So if you're watching this and you say, gosh, I really wish my school board would recognize that we don't want these changes coming into effect, you can give that model policy to school board members and ask them to pass it. There's also different letters and things that you can do, but the biggest thing is to get involved and create awareness. Talk to your friends about this. I think for a long time there's been this push for moms to not talk about politics or anything that's going to cause division, right? The truth of the matter is, I want you talking about this at the dry cleaner, on the playground, while you're waiting to pick up your kids, at your work. Now is the time to stand. If the Biden administration continues, if they win this next election and this rule continues to go forward, they're changing the culture and the fabric of our country. And we can't allow them to do that. So I just suggest people go to that resource page, check out the lawsuit that we filed, and hopefully Kim will have some more news on the next panel.
To do more than just bake cupcakes for your kids.
Yeah, that's right.
Right, although that's important to you. Last question before we open it up to the audience. Paula, how did your teammates react to you taking this stance?
It's kind of crazy because 3 of them have reached out to me in support. For the most part, it's an interesting situation where I would say about 85% of my team agreed to some extent that it was wrong that he was competing with us. It was wrong that he was undressing with us. But many of them had the stance, well, I can have this opinion, but I need to keep it to myself. And that comes from pressure from their parents, pressure from their peers, pressure from the university itself, right? They really wanted everyone to come across as you're tolerant and you're inclusive, and the way you do that is by undressing in front of a man. And it's crazy. I mean, it's funny to say that, but it really is true. We've really come to this point in this country where people aren't even willing to stand up for what they believe in. I know that they agree with me, and they won't even say it out loud. And sometimes, they admit it to themselves, and then they, reprogram their brain into thinking that it's wrong. And that is what I actually saw at the university. I had one teammate go, and she was so fed up with it. She was like, this is the worst thing ever. I'm going to talk to the athletic department. I said, you go. I'm so proud of you. She went to the athletic department, came back from the meeting, and said, guys, we have to support this because this is progressive, this is progress, and this is a great thing that's happening, and we're part of a history-making team. She came out, and it's 1984 happening in front of us, right? You go into this room, and then your opinion is completely changed. And I think that's really why this is an issue that you need to speak about it, even if it's locally, even if it's at small levels, because just having that opinion, having that voice, it opens the door for other people. I mean, I went on later in my life. I actually worked in a corporate job in finance in New York City, and people knew the story, and they heard I was on the University of Pennsylvania swim team, and they would, very quietly be like, oh, well, what do you think about it? And I would tell them the truth, and then they'd be like, oh, thank God. And I think I said to them, and I said, why are you waiting for validation from me that I have the same opinion as you? You should tell me that you thought it was wrong, and if I, for some reason, am one of those crazy brainwashed people that disagrees, you should be willing to have the conversation with me. Why are you not willing to say that? And I think that's really where we are. People are afraid of saying something that might upset somebody. They're afraid of speaking the truth because, it might hurt somebody's feelings. We don't have time for that anymore. We are at the point where people are being put in danger. There are girls who are being injured by these athletes. There are people being assaulted in bathrooms. We don't have time to just be accommodating and nice anymore. And I think that's really what my biggest message to, my teammates who are so quiet about it, to everyone who's still quiet about it. You have to speak up. And if you do, other people will come with you and you'll have support. And I think people think it's going to be isolating and lonely. But the reality is, and the polling shows us, is that 85% of Americans agree. So why are we so scared? So just again, it's time to speak up, and it's time to do it now.
Well said. We often get asked what the army of DEI bureaucrats do in academia, and I think now we know. This is the political orthodoxy that they're there to enforce. Well, we'd love to open it up to audience questions. Just raise your hand, and if you'll wait on the microphone to come around, we'll go over here to the front. Ma'am, and yes, perfect.
Hi, this is Teresa Manning with the National Association of Scholars. Thank you to all the panelists for your remarks. Tiffany, is your group calling for the resignation of Miguel Cardona at the Education Department? Is that something we should do? And maybe while we're at it, Merrick Garland, who called parents domestic terrorists?
His time is almost up. My advice to Miguel Cardona is start packing your office.
You're here. Yes, ma'am. We'll go in the front.
Hi, thank you so much for this terrific panel. I'm also a swimmer, went to Penn before all this craziness started, thank God. However, I do live in nutty DC, and I had an incident when I went to the locker room where there was a 6'2", broad-shouldered man, and thank God I had a towel wrapped around me, and I just kept walking to the bathroom section. But there were a ton of people, girls, 5 to 65, because they had closed early, so everybody was in there. And we were all trying to leave early because for whatever reason they were telling us we're leaving early. And I reported it to the front desk, and several people apparently did the same. And we were told that they can't violate anyone's rights. Now this man, I would be opposed to it even if he thought he was a woman, but I don't even think he thought so. He had no alterations. He was wearing a men's bathing suit. He lingered for 40 minutes, and I told the staff, I have rights too. I'm not going in there until he leaves. My question to you is, I now have read the crazy DC law, which it's the same as Title IX, I guess, but it gives examples saying that if a man wants to go into a women's locker room, it's discrimination under the DC Human Rights Act. And my question to you is, are you also fighting for, obviously Title IX is more important because it's federal, but are you also fighting for the localities that have passed these crazy laws that allow this?
Yeah, and I think that's the point. You know, you mentioned California. The fact is that the fight it does not stop with Title IX. I mean, first of all, I don't think Title IX is going to be implemented. They have been slammed with, how many, is it 9, 10 lawsuits now? I mean, we were the 8th. So, you know, I don't think it's going to be implemented. But the truth is the fight doesn't stop. And, when this came into the school district, and Manny knows this, when it came into the school district, it didn't come through the school board. It came through the Student Services Department, through the DEI stuff. They get it in under the radar and they make it procedure. And do all teachers want to do this? No. In fact, I think the vast majority don't want to do this, but there's so much pressure from the unions and to conform, and there's so much liability that's placed on them if you don't do this, to your point. But the fight doesn't stop here. The fight continues, and so we work at every level. And just to say, that's what the Biden administration, that's what these nonprofits that they fund, the left funds, that's what they did. They pushed it up through the bottom, and then they come from the top and they pretend like, well, it's happening everywhere. We should just, it needs to be allowed. No. And so we'll stop this, and then the fight continues to stop the ideologues from using our schools as a weapon to destroy our country. So you have to fight locally. It's the most important thing that we can do.
Let me go in the back.
Yeah, I'd like to ask the Attorney General, where do you think this is going? What is the ultimate end game that this is moving towards? It's very confusing.
Well, I'm not the Attorney General. I'm the Secretary of Education in Florida. But I will tell you, and we've had this conversation in small groups, I think this is clearly part of a broader agenda. If you look, this didn't start yesterday. This thing has been brewing. And it started with the movement at first infecting our higher ed institutions, and then finally trickling down into our K-12 system coming for our kids. This has been brewing, and I think it's an overarching plan. All of these movements you see, whether it be the CRT movement to try to create the DEI movement, this movement and this rule is part of that movement, all has Marxist roots. They're trying to erase the truth so that then when they erase the truth, they can impose on you these censors. It reminds me of the stories that I would hear from my grandparents coming out of Castro's Cuba, where you had these committees that were in charge. It is 1984. It's these committees that were designated to specifically censor and tell on and out people who were thinking independently or just acting rationally within their human freedom. This is just a component of that larger movement that is trying to infect our country. And that's why something that was said here has been repeated is, number one, we have to have the courage to continue the fight, and we have to stop being polite about it, because this is now you're protecting the rights of people who have traditional values, of traditional families, of people that just want to raise their kids in the normal old American fashion, and that's being targeted, and we are being portrayed to be bigots or not tolerant or whatever title of the week that they use. So I think it's important that the message be that we continue to fight this, not only at all levels, but just not in this lane, in every single lane that they're trying to open this up in every single silo so they can create this dystopia.
Let me go up front here.
Thank you all for being here. So if any of these cases, the mountain of lawsuits goes up to the Supreme Court, I'm wondering what you guys think as to how that might go down, because in 2020, the Supreme Court gave its Bostock decision where Neil Gorsuch basically invented this idea that the Civil Rights Act protects gender identity. And I noticed the Biden administration cited Bostock in the Title IX rule. So just what might happen there, considering that this will force this current Supreme Court to reckon with its transgender ruling from just a couple years ago?
Well, I'm not an attorney, so I'm not going to venture to predict what the Supreme Court is going to do.
Elevated to AG a minute ago. So
yes, apparently. But I do think that I'm hopeful that the Supreme Court will see this. There's several grounds here, and again, I'm not an attorney, but just from being a former social studies teacher and just civics in general of our form of government, if you're looking at this is an act of Congress that was passed in 1972 by elected leaders, signed by an elected president at the time, and it was transformational. And now you have unelected bureaucrats trying to honestly create the complete opposite of the spirit of that law through a process of rulemaking, not to mention the violations of the Constitution. And in every single one of these states that have statutes protecting women's sports, protecting private spaces, protecting against the type of thing with the misgendering and turning into sexual. I mean, if you look at that alone, I don't see how that could be held up. I mean, it's clear cut to me. But again, I'm not an attorney.
Well, and our next panel is going to delve into all the legal analysis, so they will be able to give you a perfect answer to that. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I want to say first, you talked about the siloing. We have to watch out for the international silos too. The World Health Organization is on to this as well. And you talked about moms not wanting to talk about politics. Well, there's another group that doesn't like talking about politics sometimes, and it's church pastors. And we have a big problem with church pastors who hide behind Bible verses that say, to respect the government and everything. So we need to stop that. And I'm just wondering if, because of Florida and because of all that you've done, is that any different? Do you see any more of like pastors speaking out about standing against the Title IX stuff?
So in Florida, we've been fortunate, and that doesn't mean that it's all of them, because you do have individuals that take that title that do show up to testify and that do twist, either scripture or other things to try to protect that movement, which I can't fathom and understand. I have some, I'm skeptical and probably some cynicism as to the origins of why that's happening. But I do think that we do have a good number of religious leaders that have come out and have been, again, have shown the courage to speak the truth. I think this is about speaking the truth and protecting the truth.
Yes, ma'am, in the purple.
Thank you for speaking, and my question is for Paula. So one thing you discussed was being socially blackmailed to comply with the program. And I'm wondering, before you achieved notoriety and had the support of the media and the Heritage Foundation, do you think that the conservative community, or as this lady mentioned, the church communities were there for you, offering you friendship, offering you alternative internships so that you could survive outside Biden's system?
Okay. This one I get into sometimes, and so we were just talking about these church groups. I was part of a church group at school, and the beginning, they were not very supportive of me speaking out about this. Again, there's sort of this, and again, this is not against anyone who's part of any of these communities, but there is this concept, right, where we want to be loving as Christians. We want to be loving, we want to be caring, we want to be accepting, but we also have truth. And I think a lot of people, especially first being exposed to this issue, really struggled with that balance, right? What does it look like? Is it truthful for me to say Leah Thomas is a man, or is that hateful? Am I hating him? Right? And so a lot of Christians really, really struggled with that. And I think this is where we need more leadership. It should not be from me, a 24-year-old speaking about this.
It should be you. It should be you. Why not you?
I mean,
right?
but you look to the leaders in church, right? You look to your pastor, to your priest, whatever your denomination is. And I think that is where this is really challenging, and we need to provide them with guidance on this. We need to talk about the caring thing to do is to tell the truth. And when I came to that realization, other people started to get on board, but it wasn't immediate. And so at the very beginning, it was isolating because I felt maybe I was a bad Christian. I felt maybe I was a bad person. Maybe I was disobeying what the Bible tells me to do. And I, as I grappled with it and prayed on it a lot, I mean, I eventually came to the conclusion again, right, that the caring thing to do is to tell the truth. And this is not to shade Leah Thomas or any transgender individual. I wish nothing but the best for them. I wish nothing but peace in their life, and I wish that they would not reject the body that God gave them. But you know, there's difficult situations people are in, and the only thing we can do is love them. And the loving thing to do is say, you don't need to mutilate your body to be happy. You need acceptance in other ways, and you need to accept the body that you're given and all the gifts that God gave you. And coming to that, that's really how I came to terms with everything I experienced. And there's other people who have come around. I've had people in my church community that originally didn't agree with me come around and tell me that they support me. So that's all you can really do. But I do think we do, as if you're a Christian or whatever community you're part of, you really do have to speak about this, and you have to encourage the leaders to speak about it too, because that helps bring the masses with them.
Or become a leader. I just want to share something. I think that Americans for so long were like waiting for this expert class, or we had this expert class who was going to tell us like, oh, okay, you're the person I listen to. And COVID showed us that there were a lot of people who considered themselves leaders and experts who made horrible decisions and led our country astray. And so my challenge to every American is be like Paula. Honestly, be a leader. If you have, just because someone's older in your church community doesn't mean that they maybe are the right leader in this time. If they're not willing to tell the truth, well, then you need to think about how you can be a leader. And you go tell the truth. Because I promise you, when you stand and you tell the truth, people will come to you. The truth will prevail on this issue. The only thing that's happening right now is how many more children will be harmed before we stop this madness.
That is a great note to end on. Tiffany, Paula, Commissioner Diaz, thank each and every one of you for your courage and your leadership. Now I'd like to welcome back Sarah Parshall-Perry, who is the Senior Legal Fellow in our Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies.
Well, thank you, Lindsay, for an informative and passionate discussion. I get to geek out with the lawyers, the fellow lawyer in the room, about how we can actually put metal on the teeth that are coming down for this rule, how we can actually shred it from the top into the grassroots level, what our options are. So I'm excited to be able to welcome my guest today. As a reminder to those of you who are watching online, this will be recorded. You can share this piece of information and send it to people who don't know what the impacts are or how to challenge the rule. You've heard about how Title IX has been manipulated to fit an agenda. You've learned about the new rules changes and inclusions. And in the next discussion, I'm going to be joined by lawyers in the trenches of the fight at the state level and in public interest law. And they're in the fight for ideologically neutral education and state sovereignty. And we're going to address the legal and administrative challenges to the rule. Are there options to slow the rule's advancement and its enforcement date of August 1st? So I'm going to introduce my guests, and then I will welcome them to the stage. Southeast Legal Foundation's Kim Herman is their executive director. Since 2009, she has been working with Southeastern Legal, where she has dedicated her legal career to the freedom-based law movement. She advances liberty through litigation in federal, state, and appellate courts, and on issues ranging from government overreach to free speech, property rights, and economic liberty. Louisiana Attorney General Liz Murrill is the first female Attorney General, which seems fitting today for our conversation. In Louisiana's history, she was formerly the Solicitor General of the state. She's held positions in former Governor Bobby Jindal's administration and has made a name for herself in the battle against federal overreach, leading the charge on behalf of Louisiana, Montana, Mississippi, and Idaho in one of the first legal challenges to the Biden administration's final Title IX rule. And last but not least, my fellow former colleague at the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, Christian Corrigan, who is now the Montana Solicitor General. Let me welcome all of my panelists to the stage. Well, we got a lot of good questions in the last panel, and they've actually teed up some of the things that I want to address. But Christian, I'm going to start with you. You and I worked together on a Title IX rule that has been essentially gutted, top to bottom. Can you talk a little bit about that rule and what's actually been eliminated now? What did we put into place that's now been entirely rolled back?
Yeah, so as folks know, Title IX has been around since 1972, and the first major rulemaking under Title IX occurred a few years later. And for decades after that, there had actually been no additional regulations that the Department of Education put out. Most of it was done by what was called Dear Colleague letters. So these would be guidance documents issued by the Department of Education telling recipients of federal funding, schools, this is how you have to act, or we're going to initiate an enforcement action against you for a violation of Title IX. And so one of the big initiatives and promises that former Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos put in place when she came into office was to revamp the Title IX system. And sort of the genesis of that was the Obama administration's sort of rule by Dear Colleague letter and the kangaroo courts that were happening on college campuses on misconduct allegations that were doing some of the same things the new rule is doing, chilling free speech, debate about gender ideology back then. And so what Secretary DeVos did is go through the formal rulemaking process, went through 120,000 public comments, which at the time seemed enormous, and compared to the new rule, was about half that. But what the rule did is it simply said that and it's sort of back up, Title IX prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in education. And the courts interpreted that to mean that certain incidents, such as sexual harassment, can deprive someone of equal access to education. And so what the courts had said is that schools have an obligation to address those allegations of sexual harassment. But unfortunately, what happened was these schools were instituting what we considered kangaroo courts, railroading students, not providing due process to notice of charges against them. And it really was a terrible system. And so Secretary DeVos came into office and said, no, we're going to provide for a fair, balanced, and equitable system so that the accused and victims both have rights and are both able to see this process play out. And so one of the big things that I think our rule took a lot of care to do was to make sure that enforcement of Title IX didn't violate the First Amendment and didn't violate sort of core American values. And as Sarah said, it's been almost entirely gutted by the Biden administration's rule, which, to be fair, was a promise that that candidate Biden made and some of his allies made upon coming into office. So essentially, since day one of the administration, we've been preparing to fight this back.
So you mentioned free speech, so I want to go to Kim for a second. Free speech is one of the specialties of SLF, and there is, of course, sort of a head fake situation in this rule, because if you go through the 1,500 pages, there is what is essentially an empty promise that this isn't sort of contrary to any protection of free speech under the First Amendment. Do you buy that promise? And if not, why not?
I certainly don't buy that promise, and neither do some of the federal judges who have been hearing these cases throughout the country. I know we're going to talk more about those lawsuits, but we've already had 2 federal judges enjoin enforcement of Title IX right now in a number of states. I know Sarah can list them off from the top of her head. But in the most recent one in Tennessee, which just came down, the judge devoted 24 pages to explaining why this rule does violate the First Amendment. It does it in several ways. It both compels speech and it chills speech. And as we all know, the First Amendment protects our right to speak and to not speak. And so when a child goes into school, and it could even be their teacher, let's say their teacher decides, they have a male teacher, and that male teacher decides that they're identifying as a woman, and that child does not want to call the male teacher a she, because this child believes in biological sex. This child can now be brought up on sexual harassment charges. Or if you take, as Tiffany mentioned, some of the moms involved in our lawsuit with Moms for Liberty. We have a mom whose daughters play tennis, and they play against a team who has an adult male coach who identifies as a woman. He insists on using the women's locker room. So you have an adult male coach changing in front of teenage girls. If they want to speak up for their physical safety, if they even say, "This makes me uncomfortable," they will now be the ones charged with sexual harassment, not him. So it's more of kind of the examples that Paula was giving. She was giving her personal experiences. It's not just at one school. This is all throughout the country. And so we are confident that our judge, who is hearing our case right now in Kansas, is also going to agree that this violates the First Amendment.
General Murrell, the state of Louisiana has passed some excellent legislation protecting biological sex as a notion under state law, but we're dealing with the interpretation of state law and the interpretation of federal law. Does a federal regulation trump a state law duly enacted? And what's the positioning of the state of Louisiana in the prevailing argument?
Well, so the answer to that is yes. A validly enacted regulation by the federal government can preempt state law. Part of those law, the fact that it is preempting state law is part of what gives us standing to challenge the rules in the first place. And so our legislature has been very affirmative about laying down the law that it believes to be proper and true. And so I'm grateful for that. And, I think that certainly all of the things that we've talked about here are true. This is a punitive law. And in most situations where a adult male is exposing himself to teenage girls in a locker room, we would call that a crime. And so, someone can be arrested for obscenity or for exposure. And it's only under this crazy gaslighting that all of a sudden we are wrong. And not only are we wrong, we are told that we can't complain about it. And if you do complain about it or you observe what you believe to be true, so a kindergartner, for example, who is just naturally thinking, well, that's a man or that's a woman. And you're not a he, you're a she, or you're a she, or he. I mean, they are being propagandized from a very, very young age to suspend what is reality to them in a very sort of clear way, and not believe what they see to be true. It's a very, very dangerous thing. It's really dangerous for women because we have tried to teach women to not be afraid to speak, to speak out when they are uncomfortable, and now they are being told that you are going to be punished if you do that, and are being punished for doing that. And I think it's terribly dangerous for women. I'm glad that our state has taken a very strong position on it, and so has Cade Brumley, our superintendent of education, who's here today too.
Christian, I did not think I would ever be sort of a dilettante expert in administrative law, but I want to talk a little bit about the Administrative Procedure Act, right? Something I know more about now than I ever thought I would, because I avoided admin law when I was in law school. Talk a little bit about what the APA guarantees and how it guides the federal rulemaking process, and really what the positioning is of the state of Montana based on violations of the APA.
Yeah, so some of you may be old enough to remember that Congress used to make laws. And when Congress makes laws, administrative agencies get to fill in the gaps and put out rules, mostly to tell regulated parties how they can comply with the law. And so that's no different at the Department of Education. As I said earlier, Title IX had regulations that came out governing things such as sex-separated athletics in the 70s. And so administrative agencies make rules through a statute from, goodness, 70 years ago called the Administrative Procedures Act. And that's essentially the rules of the road that sets forth how courts review an agency action when a plaintiff, like a state, comes and challenges it. And you can pretty much put those into two buckets. The first would be substantive legal challenges, that a particular rule violates the Constitution, that it exceeds the authority given to it by Congress. But then there's also a procedural aspect. And so sometimes an agency can actually have the authority to put out a rule, but if they don't follow the proper procedure, a court will actually enjoin the rule and send it back to the agency and say, try again. So the APA puts forth what's called the notice and comment rulemaking process. And there are exceptions to this, of course, like every law. But in general, when an agency is going to make a new set of regulations, they have to tell the public. And they have to put out what's called a notice of proposed rulemaking and say, this is what we intend to do, and this is why we're going to do it. And as I said earlier, the public has to have the opportunity to comment on those rules and explain why they think those rules should go into effect, why they shouldn't, or why they should be changed. And they present the agency with different considerations. And then when the comment period closes, the agency has to meaningfully consider those comments. And then when the final rule comes out, they have to explain their decision. They have to show their math. And so many of the arguments against a lot of the federal agency actions, including Title IX, are that the agency failed to meaningfully consider an important part of the problem, or that they simply made the wrong decision based on science, whatever it is. And so the states have lodged both categories of objections. As we talked earlier, the law is unconstitutional, or the rule is unconstitutional. It violates the authority delegated to the agency by Congress. But under the APA, there's also procedural violations. They fail to, one of the biggest glaring holes in the rule is that it's supposed to cover gender identity, but they can't even define what gender identity is. And as I've said before, it's sort of, well, we're experts and you'll know it when we see it. And that is absolutely not the way to govern, and it's not the way that a regulated party like a state, which has billions upon billions of federal funding at stake, should have to go about its administration of an important statute like Title IX.
So, Kim, let's talk a little bit about Chevron deference, shall we? We like to think that we are very of the moment here at Heritage Foundation, and we know that we are waiting on just a handful of cases now, probably around 19, for the Supreme Court's term to end, and two of the big ones are the Relentless and Loper-Bright cases, and they deal with Chevron deference. The reason I bring that up is twofold. First, because I want to ask whether or not it will make our job easier in litigating these types of cases if Chevron goes. And second, because you had an interesting dialogue that was relayed to you in your hearing for a preliminary injunction in which agency deference was mentioned. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. When we're talking about Chevron deference, we're talking about giving agencies, so these are not our elected officials, right? This is just part of the executive branch, those that, govern with a pen and a phone, giving them the ultimate authority to decide what statutes mean, what their own regulations mean. It is giving them kind of just a blanket ability to say not only what the law is, but what it means, which is a judicial function, right? We have separation of powers in this country. It is a fundamental principle of our Constitution. And so it is dangerous when we are giving these agencies too much deference or any deference at all. And what Sarah's talking about, I've got it called up on my phone because I don't want to misstate this. But in our hearing, which is, I believe, still ongoing, it might be over, our judge actually asked the Department of Justice, who is representing the Department of Education, he said, sometimes we defer to agencies on the basis of their expertise, and that leads me to wonder, what is the Department of Education's expertise on human biology and human sexuality that allows it to make these sorts of determinations about the harm or lack of harm resulting from sharing intimate spaces like bathrooms, locker rooms, and showers? And he went on, and the response he got was, I guess I'm not sure. Now, that's just an excerpt. I wasn't there. Obviously, I'm here with everyone in D.C., so yes, I'm taking that out of the entire transcript. We'll see how the entire hearing went, but it gives you just a little bit of flavor to see why are bureaucrats in the Department of Education deciding what and changing, really, not just deciding, but changing the meaning of Title IX when Congress has tried to do this, right? They were unable to do this. And so now we had to have an agency come in. So hopefully that answers what you were looking for.
Oh, it definitely does. General Merle, let me ask you, as we are sort of approaching the midpoint of summer, there are parents and local educators and school administrators and state administrators all sort of in a scramble at this point. How have you advised stakeholders with the superintendent? How have you advised them on how they ought to approach the upcoming year based on your current litigation position?
So we did obtain a preliminary injunction. So our educators and our educational system is, in fact, protected from the enforcement of this rule, as are our state, the partners who were with us in the lawsuit, Idaho, Mississippi, and Montana. But Cade and I stood up at a press conference when we announced the lawsuit and said, do not comply. Do not comply. And, one of the fundamental things about this, this attack on us is that 50 years since Title IX has consistently, it originated as a law to protect women from discrimination. It has always been interpreted that way. It was expanded to cover sexual harassment. So there's never been any question about what this law was intended to protect and who it was intended to protect. And for thousands of years, we have had a common understanding of what male and female is. And so, to your point about agency deference, this implicates the major questions doctrine. That's all part of our lawsuits. But at the end of the day, we were very confident that this would be blocked. And I would have, and we did invite the Department of Education, which somebody asked what should be done. We should just abolish the Department of Education, not just ask the
Well, that's the official heritage position.
Let's get rid of the whole Department of Education. We have our own departments of education. Education has always been an inherently local thing, and so it should stay that way, curriculum and everything else. So I think the federal government has gotten way too involved in this way. It really is trying to change society. There is no better example of the major questions doctrine and overreach by the federal government in this area. So, we said don't comply. We now have an injunction. 10 states are now, I think, protected. I believe that another one will issue soon. Based on that quote, you would think it should have just been game over. This is, you can't answer that question. If your answer to that question is, I'm not sure, this is over. I think it will end up in the United States Supreme Court unless there's a change in administration, in which case we will see a rollback of this rule forthwith. But I do think that this whole push to say Bostock requires this is entirely wrong.
So that's a perfect segue. I'd like to thank you for that, General Merle. Christian, let's talk about our favorite case, the case on which the administration has hung its hat in every expansion of sex to include gender identity in federal law. And as Alito wrote in the dissent to that opinion, there are over 100 federal laws and regulations that contain specific provisions on preventing sex discrimination. So let's talk about Bostock and how your state has responded specifically to the fact that Bostock does not, in fact, apply to Title IX?
Yeah, so this is part of the Biden administration's whole of government approach, right? Bostock is going to be applied everywhere, whether it's, never mind that Bostock was a Title VII challenge, which is an employment statute, an entirely different statute than Title IX, enacted for a different purpose at a different time, has different interpreting regulations. But the problem is the federal government has said that is the law of the land, and we are going to implement all kinds of other statutes, some that incorporate Title IX, others that incorporate other non-discrimination provisions, and you have to comply with Bostock, whether you like it or not, if you are going to receive federal funds or be a state that is part of our federal system. And so one of the areas where we've pushed back is against the Department of Health and Human Services. They came out with a rule just a few weeks ago under Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act. That actually just simply says that states that receive federal funds in healthcare can't discriminate on the basis of sex. It actually specifically incorporates Title IX. This is problematic. As many of you know, the states have passed laws over the last few years that prohibit certain types of surgeries and treatment on minors, and I think there's something like 20 different states have done that. So it absolutely conflicts with state law. It puts doctors and providers in a difficult position to choose between following state law and following the dictates of the federal administration. And so we filed a lawsuit with Texas just a few weeks ago. The rest of several of the other states filed, I believe, in Florida a few weeks ago. But this is another area where the administration is using Bostock and Title IX to sort of enforce its social agenda against the states to say, if you want Medicaid funding, if you want CHIP funding, you are going to have to comply and you're going to have to violate state law. And we think for some of the same reasons we push back on Title IX. We think that's unacceptable and violates their authority.
So it will definitely incite more litigation because obviously the interrelatedness of Title IX with other anti-discrimination law, like Section 1557, we think it's just education. It's really not. It's about a lot more. And I do think for this administration, the Title IX fight for them, that complete reinvention of anti-discrimination law, was in many respects the brass ring for the administration, right? So if you're looking to redefine biological reality, you take the only federal law essentially passed as a crowning achievement of the women's liberation movement solely to prevent sex discrimination and provide women equal opportunity. You eviscerate that, then of course it's fair game for everything else. So Kim, let me ask you, we talked a little bit, we heard from Tiffany Justice in the last panel. Let's talk a little bit about the parental rights implications of this, because I think that is an element of this rule change that surprises people, right? So we immediately know about the expansion of sex to include gender identity, but there are also free speech implications, as we've discussed, due process protections that have been rolled back for individuals who are accused of sexual misconduct on campus. We had secured those under the previous administration, making sure that those individuals had a right to cross-examine and had live hearings. But the parental rights angle, talk to me about that, because for individuals who may be watching online, they think, oh, if my daughter's not in athletics, my future, my interaction with this is not going to be implicated.
I wish that was the case for them, but unfortunately it's not. Right? In America, we have a fundamental right to direct the upbringing of our children. Title IX, the changes to Title IX, I should say, do completely eviscerate that. There are provisions in the new Title IX rule that say that it will supersede FERPA. That is a federal law that protects privacy of your child. It also ensures that parents can have access to their child's records. So if your child goes to school, they decide or they are encouraged that they want to be called by a different name or by a different pronoun. These changes in Title IX now are going to essentially give the school the ability to hide that from you and look to federal law in the past, parents could look to federal law to help them if they weren't in a state that was doing the great work, like my fellow speakers up here today. Now, those laws are being completely turned on their head, and they're basically being, written out of law. I don't know how else to say it. You have an administration, you have an executive federal agency that is saying what Congress didn't matter in Title IX, and what Congress did in FERPA and these other federal privacy rights don't matter either. And so parents need to speak back about that. They need to watch what their school boards are doing. It's not just going to be about the Title IX policies that they're going to be implementing. Also look at the privacy laws and if they are writing into their policies the ability to hide things from you as parents.
Yeah, we actually talked a little bit about these school confidentiality policies. I'll give a little plug for our scholarship. My colleague Tom Jipping and I wrote a very long paper about how they are unconstitutional.
Great, you should read it.
But I will say, I think there is sort of a patent misunderstanding specifically on how FERPA is applied. So a lot of these school districts that are hiding this information from parents have cited FERPA as the purported basis for we can't reveal a student's gender identity. No. The FERPA right is actually held by the parent until the child gets to be 18, at which point that right transfers to the adult child. So I think that interrelatedness with privacy laws are incredibly misunderstood, but they are really a basis, I think, all of us as lawyers and stakeholders and thought leaders and parents need to pay very, very close attention to, because privacy provisions are going to either, I think, make or break a lot of what we're doing right now. General Merle, let me ask you, what do you believe that the states need more of in this particular fight? Now, naturally, some of the states are not going to be keen to litigate against the federal government because of their leadership and because of the fact that they have administrations that are essentially in lockstep with the federal government. How would you advise state legislators in their fight to protect biological reality?
Well, I do think every state, it's going to vary state to state depending on what their politics are of their leadership. And what I would say is that each individual who is has a child or is a person who is subjected to this can reach out to organizations like Southeast Legal or ADF, and I think find organizations that they can join with who will litigate on their behalf. So there is an outlet, I think, for anybody who wants to fight this to fight it. And of course, we intend to fight it and have been. We didn't just start this fight on the Title IX rules that just came out. We've been challenging this since the first Dear Colleague letters came out and the guidance came out, and we have obtained injunctions every step of the way. It just shows you how insistent this administration is on continuing to try and force this down and implement it in a way that is embedded in our educational institutions. And I think for them, if they can implement it against half the states who are voluntarily complying with it, or may have adopted state laws that are consistent with it, huge win for them. Now half the country has basically adopted a viewpoint that is in fundamental tension, not just tension, contradiction with a lot of the fundamental principles that we hold dear, like parental rights, like basic concepts of biological truth and physical truth and differences, safe spaces for actual women, that's gone. So, I think that we have to kind of think about what's happening. We do need Congress to act. Congress can act. Bostock was a decision that was based on interpretation of a statute. So Congress could override that. We litigated this issue in Louisiana in 2016 on the basis of an executive order that had been issued by the governor, who's a Democrat, and we did not comply. We said we weren't going to comply. It was trying to impose this changing anti-discrimination language in state procurement contracts. We said that's not what the law is. And so we're not going to change this to impose greater restrictions on us and you have to go through these procedures. It violates the State Administrative Procedures Act, and 700 state laws had the words in them of male, female, mother, father, boy, girl, some fundamental representation of sex. It affected child custody. It affected all kinds of things. And so, we were able to convince a judge that the governor was trying to make law by executive order. That violated separation of powers. He couldn't do it. So that's been embedded in Louisiana law since 2016. I think that you have to be willing to go and fight these fights, and it affects you personally. You need to find somebody who will represent you and go out there and do it, because unfortunately we do have some states that are very compliant.
Christian, what options does the next administration, notice I say a different administration, I say the next administration, when it comes to this particular rulemaking process? We know that many of these begin with, for example, an executive order, and then from there it's informal guidance saying this is how we're going to interpret the law, and then the formal rulemaking process. What does day one at OCR look like for the next Department of Ed?
Yeah, so I think that the next administration has a few options. So I would anticipate that the next administration is going to say we intend to do, obviously it depends on what the courts ultimately do, if the courts have issued a final decision on various aspects of the rule. But I assume the next administration is going to say we intend to repeal this rule almost entirely. But as I discussed earlier, that doesn't happen overnight. You can't do that overnight. The Administrative Procedure Act doesn't let you do that. So number one, they'll undertake a rulemaking process. I think that there are, assuming that there's a change of administration, there's an underutilized provision of the APA where someone can submit a petition for rulemaking to put that before the agency to help tee things up early on. But also OCR, the Office for Civil Rights, has a great deal of discretion when it comes to enforcing. And so OCR can take positions and tell recipients of federal funding that we think that this particular aspect of the rule, whether it's being litigated or whether it's been interpreted a certain way in the past, is unconstitutional, or we're not going to enforce it in a way that chills First Amendment rights. And so the enormous amount of power that the administration has to compel schools to act one way or another, in my opinion, that's actually a bad thing, but we have to play under the system and under the rules that we have. So the next administration has a number of options. They can also do, under the Administrative Procedure Act, what's called a notice of interpretation. Now, the funny thing about that is that I think was referenced earlier, this administration, prior to putting out their formal rulemaking, actually did a notice of interpretation and some guidance documents saying we're going to incorporate Bostock, and several federal courts now struck that down and said that you've failed to follow all kinds of procedures, so that's invalid. So they're sort of half measure to start. But it's going to be, a gargantuan task. I would say General Murrow mentioned Congress, and I think that's a really important part of this. And so, if you happen to live or would like to live in, say, Montana, Ohio, Nevada, that's going to be really important, starting in January of 2025, because we need, for several of these really bad provisions and things that are harmful to the states, we need Congress to fix these, including Title VII.
Well, and to your point about the notice of interpretation, there's no way you can interpret what they put out any other way. I mean, it has very overt statements in it about how even a single instance of misgendering someone can be discrimination, and it requires investigation and action. So I don't know how you interpret. There's nothing to interpret that isn't completely contrary to what they put out, which creates an issue for the APA in terms of revoking. We just have to repeal it, and I think there will be more injunctions. So that will certainly help move that process along, and we'll make those injunctions permanent. But it is going to be a process, and we have seen a lot of rules coming out. I mean, I would say not just here. This is one of the biggest ones that I think they tried to push out before they were subject to the Congressional Review Act. So I think that they are trying to push things out. We've seen it a lot in energy policy and climate too. And so I think you'll continue to see that all the way up until whenever they hit that deadline, which is probably around August, somewhere in August.
This is a question really for the entire panel before we open it up to questions. If you're watching this online and you think, well, is there anything I can do as John Q. Public to fight this, right? We're hearing a lot of the sort of administrative state, what's being done behind the scenes at Department of Education. You all are litigating, you're on the front lines fighting this in court. If you are just an average parent with a kid who is in a school subject to this upcoming rule, how do you advise them?
I guess I'll kick us off there. There's a couple of things. One is you need to educate yourself. There are groups like ours, Mountain States Legal Foundation, who we're co-counseling with, Moms for Liberty themselves, who are holding webinars, trainings. You can contact us. Almost every single evening, I am training parents on Title IX and parental rights. We've got guidebooks coming out, deep dives. So just really stay educated and talk to your fellow parents. They might not have ever heard of Title IX. I have many friends, this is what I do for a living, I have many friends that still don't understand why they need to care about Title IX, so I won't ever stop talking about it constantly. I'm driving them crazy. And educate your kids. Talk to your kids about these issues. Don't shy away from them. They need to understand that not only do they have rights, but they need to understand what a lot of schools are doing. It can be as simple as just a TV show that they're watching on Netflix, and all of a sudden you kind of hear something and you're immediately like, turn that show off, and they want to know why. Explain to them why. Kids are smart. We don't give them enough credit. I've got a 7 and 10-year-old, and you talk to them at an age-appropriate level, but if we don't educate them, then they are just going to, fall prey to this system that's throughout all of our schools. And so maybe that's just my plea as a mom, not as an attorney. But that's really why we're all fighting this fight, right? It's to save our country for our kids. So,
and I would say, I really want to see more support for people like Paula and Riley Gaines. These women are really putting themselves on the line to step out and be a voice for other women, their peers. I have certainly spoken to coaches who fear the retribution and the mob and the kind of attacks. They fear the effect on their ability to coach and to work. And so, I think we really have to be willing to support these people who are being directly affected by it, whether it's your children, someone else's children, or college athletes, because I think they are being told they can't talk about it, directly told they can't talk about it, told there's no one they can complain to about it, and that if they did complain, there's nothing that's going to happen for them. And I think we've got to make sure that we let them know that there is someone they can complain to about it, there will be something that can be done about it, and that what they're being told is wrong. Because they are being silenced in a way that really disempowers them. And it's it's something that we've got to be able to fight for them and protect them from the attacks on them.
Christian.
Well, I don't have much to add other than, as a former public interest lawyer, I was always taught the value of telling the human stories behind the lawsuits. And I really think that's what's helped turn the tide in public opinion, is that telling your story, speaking out, brings the average person who may not care about Title IX, it gets them to care, and it's really helped our side convey the message and how unfair and frankly just insane these rules are. And so just keep telling your stories and keep, there are a lot of great organizations, many of them here today, that have done fantastic work and will continue. And hopefully we'll defeat this thing one way or another.
And I would just add one kind of final footnote that it is not just about athletics. It is, I think that, that's one thing we spend a lot of time talking about, just the classroom and speech and parental rights and things like that. And that is something that we do need to educate people about. We tend to talk a lot about this issue in terms of the bathroom and the locker room and athletics. And that's because it's easy to explain, and people have a fundamental sense of how unfair and wrong that is when we talk about it in those terms. But it is way more pervasive than that and invasive than that. And so, I think that we do need to kind of explain to people, like, you do need to worry about it. It can affect you and your child very directly. It is going to affect your child very directly. And it's not just going to be athletics. If you don't have an athlete, you may be like, well, it doesn't affect me because I'm not an athlete.
I'm surprised at how often I mention Title IX and I get the response, "Oh, the sports rule." No, it's not. It's not just sports. This is a good segue point to open up the Florida questions, and I anticipate we'll probably have a lot of them. Yes, right here in the front.
Thank you. So I'm just wondering what happens to people my age as college students in the coming months, since this is supposed to go to effect in August. I heard you mention you joined a lawsuit with Texas. I go to a university in Texas, and Governor Greg Abbott has ordered the universities not to comply. When you have that plus the federal government saying you must comply or you lose your funding, what happens? Is a public university considered part of the state government and so they follow the governor, or what? The ultimate reason I'm asking this is because I'm just wondering, when I go back to campus this fall, am I subject to this rule?
I mean, I'll answer that just quickly. Like, we have state anti-discrimination laws too, and I think that when we as the Attorney General or the governor give advice, we are also saying we could sue you. I mean, we can enforce our rules against those government entities, and so I think that we're telling them, and that's part of the problem with this Title IX rule, this one in particular, is that it is actually telling you to violate Title IX as it's been written and was adopted by Congress to comply with these regulations. So, what I think a lot of these schools, what is pretty effective with a lot of them, is trying to avoid litigation. So they want to avoid, public entities at least usually want to avoid litigation. School boards usually want to avoid litigation. I think that in our state they've been pretty compliant. I mean, they just want direction. The problem with not fighting is that they do avoid litigation, and so they are going to comply. They are not going to want to risk losing the billions of dollars in Title IX money that is spread out among all of our states, and so we just have to keep fighting it. But we tell them, don't do it, and mostly they don't. If they do not follow our advice, then we have mechanisms to enforce against them.
And I'll just add one piece to that, which probably doesn't apply to you in Texas, because again, you have a governor and AG that are going to enforce the injunctions that are there and enforce state law. But for students, especially college students that are in our blue states, you may have to end up suing. There is going to be a phase 2 of this litigation, both at the K through 12 level and at the college level, because it's not just Title IX. There are many schools out there that are already changing their policies, or they have policies in place that look like what we are fighting against now. And so when we win and we get this stopped nationally, right, and it's stopped in every 50 state, which I believe we are actually going to be successful in doing with respect to Title IX, that's when we have to get on the ground. We have to file those OCR complaints. We have to file those lawsuits. We have to send those demand letters to the schools that are ignoring it or just saying, we don't care, we're going to have our policy anyway. So we need a lot of college students that are willing to stand up and a lot of mama bears that are willing to stand up.
And fun fact, in the entire history of Title IX's existence, no school's ever lost Title IX funding. So it's a very effective, sort of Damocles. It sounds really scary. We're going to lose billions of dollars. It never happens. It always goes to first informal resolution, and then at all costs, they try to avoid kicking it over to the DOJ. Maybe not this administration, but that's generally the process it takes. But no school's ever lost federal funding.
And I also would say that, let's don't lose sight of really, really the larger threat, and that's to kindergarten and elementary education. It's really the youngest of the children. So this movement isn't going to go away. We will win this battle on Title IX, but we are going to continue to fight it. It's like playing whack-a-mole. It's coming up everywhere, and it is also being implemented at the state level in some states. We're very divided in our country, and the push to re-educate our children at the youngest age so that they no longer have any sense of differences between male and female, and they are actually educated against believing that there's any difference at all and punished for stating what might be kind of intuitive to them. That's a re-education process that is going to mean that they ultimately win this fight. So I try to never lose sight of that we have to keep our eye on the real prize for the radical left, and that is our youngest children, because they are the ones who are forming their views of the world, and they rely very heavily on the adults around them, and they spend a lot of time sometimes without their parents.
Other questions? Yes, right here, Bernadette.
Thanks. I'm Bernadette Broyles. I'm the President General Counsel of the Child and Parental Rights Campaign. My question is about constitutional preemption, because as you know, the Supreme Court has already ruled that there is a constitutional fundamental parental right to direct the upbringing and the care of your children, as well as courts have ruled there's an equal protection right that women have to be free from sex discrimination. So the question, first of all, the answer to parents is Title IX cannot preempt your fundamental constitutionally protected rights, so keep pressing them. My question to you is, to what degree have your lawsuits, in addition to asserting the separation of powers issue, have they asserted the fact that this Title IX rule would seek to override these constitutionally protected parental rights as well as the equal protection rights for women? And I'm wondering if that's raised, or perhaps we can raise that in some way.
Well, so great points, and we certainly raised those concerns in our comments. Now, one of the great things about being a state is that there are certain aspects of the rule that are very easy for us to challenge because they're tied to federal funding. But you also have to figure out a way to challenge other aspects and make claims that you may not have standing for. I think those are really important. And to me, that's where a lot of the public interest world can get involved. But I do think the parental rights aspect is certainly very important. And one thing that was mentioned, and Bernadette, I believe this was one of your cases, which was when parents are suing, I believe it was the Massachusetts case, when parents are suing a school district for violating their fundamental rights as parents, for hiding a gender transition, when it comes to imposing liability, one of the courts in Massachusetts looked to the Massachusetts anti-discrimination statute and essentially said, well, you violated the parents' fundamental rights, but really they were just trying to comply with the spirit of the Massachusetts anti-discrimination law, so we're going to let them off the hook. And now you have a federal law that essentially blesses that as well throughout the country. And I think that's a really dangerous tool for school districts that want to be bad actors to use. And so again, thanks, Bernadette, for all the work you all have done and everybody else that's filed these parental rights lawsuits.
Other questions? Yes, back here. Run for school board. Great point. I often say those are the most important races in the country. Yes.
Hi. So I'm a young attorney in D.C., and I find that as everything in America is shifting left, I want to speak out more, but at the same time, that damages your prospects, especially in the city. I've worked on campaigns. Those aren't on my resume for most places. And I was just wondering if you guys had any thoughts on how do I be involved? How do I work in this while still making the resume palatable if I want to do something else?
Ooh, that's
How
a
do you
good
feel
question.
about moving to Montana?
I was just going to say.
Louisiana.
I would ask these individuals if they're hiring.
I went to Tulane. I love being there. I like Louisiana, but I do want to stay in D.C. So
Not sure that's going to help.
If
Look, I think that look, I'm going to say it. You just said sometimes you just have to have the courage of your convictions, and you have to decide which this administration has forced you to take a position on some of these things. Like, I mean, it used to be that you could work in a corporation, for example, and corporation would be geared toward maximizing profits for their business, selling to everyone. Now we've got all this environmental social governance movement that is infecting corporate world. There just is this massive press that is forcing you to either be with them, you're either with them or you're against them. And, you know, I think that that's very contrary to the foundations of our country, where we have sort of tried to create a place where we can have different viewpoints and still live happily among one another and be neighbors with people who may share very different viewpoints from ours. They're creating a situation where that is an intolerable position. So, you know, I think that you go seek out people who will let you have your own beliefs, or even better, find people that share them.
And you know, when you look at what's happened to the moms, right? Tiffany's here, Moms for Liberty. They have been called domestic terrorists. They have been doxxed, everything that you can absolutely imagine. And you want to know what? They are still fighting because their kids are watching. Our kids are watching. You're a young attorney. I don't know if you have kids yet, but in this fight to save our schools, that is the thing that is constantly in the back of my mind, is I want to make my children proud. Are they going to look back and say, when mom worked, when mom went to that event in DC, when mom went to court and did all of that, she was doing it to make our country better? And I am confident that as they get older, they will understand that and they will see that. We already talk about it. And so I guess my advice to you, having been a lawyer in private practice and in public interest world, is if it's that important to you, it doesn't really matter what anyone else says. Stay true to your convictions. And there is always going to be a place. If you believe something enough, you can create that space to be in it. So, and look at what the moms have taken, and they are fighting hard, and they're not backing down. So,
and public interest law is way more interesting anyway.
it's a lot of fun.
I would just add, you know, there were a lot of former Trump admin attorneys who had offers from big law pulled in 2021. And yes, public interest is there. Fortunately, there are a number of boutique conservative firms that have popped up and said, that's actually a plus for us that you have this type of experience. Cooper and Kirk, Consovoy McCarthy, Cher Jaffe, and creating an alternative ecosystem where talented, smart, dedicated attorneys can go and not have to worry about the pressures of big law. Because, I mean, let's be honest, when we get sued on an abortion case and there's 12 pro bono attorneys from WilmerHale, that's no skin off their back because they're happy to let them do it. But do they let the one or two conservative attorneys at their firm appear on a gun case or on a Title IX case, whatever it is? Of course not. So building the alternative ecosystem is really important. And that, luckily, that's sort of come up over the last few years, and I hope it grows.
Other questions? Yes, down here in front.
Hi, I'm Natalia. I'm with Restore Childhood, and we are an organization that came together during the COVID lockdowns in New York City. I voted for Biden. I believe that the progressives would help our children, and yet our children were the most restricted, eating lunch outside on the cold concrete to keep them from inside the schools because the teachers' unions had these contracts that would prohibit our kids from even having a drink of water in the classroom. They were treated worse than the Rikers Island prisoners. They had no autonomy whatsoever. And I did find that as time went on, it was easier and easier to speak out. And if you spoke to people about common sense issues and didn't allow them to chill your speech, people would come around. I even got to a point where I could speak to our principal, who's also part of the union. I mean, the principal's union does collective bargaining with the teachers' unions. Theoretically, she wouldn't be on my side. And I even brought her on to the whole gender conversation about, a year ago. I said, let's sit down, let's look at the free press and look at the whistleblowers and some of the stuff and, all of the school to clinic basically pipeline. Like, you need to be aware of what you may be enabling. And she agreed with me. And she said, I wouldn't allow my teachers to keep these secrets. I said, well, at some point, it's not going to be up to you. But I think that we need to build those coalitions. At the beginning, it was hard to walk through the schoolyard because, I was considered the Trumper, and people didn't even believe me that I voted for Biden. They were just like, you're right wing. And I've said to people over and over again, you need two wings to fly anything. Like, why is one wing better than the other? I don't want to have only one wing. But anyway, I just want to encourage everyone here to speak to people, because I really have not had a lot of confrontational, acrimonious conversations. You can speak about things and disagree and not get, personal. And as you know, I think I've spoken to you and a couple of the others here before. Our organization introduced the Urgency of Normal Toolkit 2 years ago to empower parents to fight back against the unscientific mandates for kids, and it was very successful. It gave parents a toolkit to work with and to advocate with, and we just introduced another toolkit on gender ideology in schools, and I'm hoping that people really use this, because I do think it'll be a game changer if you give parents the tools to fight back.
Thank you, Natalia. Other questions? I saw some hands back here.
Yes, hello, Ariel Knight with Liberty Counsel Action. You've spoke a lot about some of the strategies and tactics that we can use to counter the left's trend of using discrimination as the label for all of conservative ideologies. And we see that with New York trying to add abortion choices and pregnancy choices as a form of discrimination into their laws. So how far do you foresee this trend going? And then would the same countermeasures that we're using here and that you discussed also apply to those instances?
I mean, I'll sort of take it from the standpoint of trends and how far we think they're going, just because I think that the broader trend is deconstructing a lot of norms and traditions and for our country, starting with our Constitution. So, a lot of the things that you see are just, and to our last panelist's point about a lot of these have Marxist foundations, I agree with that. And I think that when you start to really drill down on all of that and you see how contrary a lot of the movement of the left is on a lot of different fronts toward the kind of concepts of liberty that are embedded in our Constitution, of separation of powers that's embedded in our Constitution, of state sovereignty that's embedded in the federal Constitution. All of those things are under attack. And so, it's really part of a larger effort to deconstruct all of the governmental institutions and foundations of our country to remake it into some other image, which I still don't think anybody's told me what it's going to be, but I'm pretty sure it ain't going to turn out very well. So, I think that there's a lot of things that are sort of happening on that front, and I don't think it's going to stop. I think what's scary, if you look at what's happened just in the kind of more recent events involving Israel and Gaza, I think that you see that, a country was attacked viciously, and they have now we see a lot of movements on college campuses and everywhere else, and social media drives a lot of this. But people who were viciously attacked, who were minding their own businesses in their own homes and were murdered, are now somehow the attackers. And so the gaslighting and the shifting of the conversation, like it's happening on a lot of fronts. And again, it's what scares me the most is capturing the minds of our youth and our young people, so that they no longer trust our most fundamental institutions. They don't trust our justice system. They don't trust their parents. They've been told they can't trust their parents. The government is creating a culture of secrecy with our children, which is terrifying. Just from a child sexual abuse standpoint, as an attorney general, I think that is terrifying. So, I don't think this is slowing down. I mean, I just think that we have to be willing to fight for fundamental principles that we believe are important, that are founded in individual liberty.
Other questions? We got time for one more, right here.
Okay, sure. Don Doherty with the Defense of Freedom Institute, and along with Christian and the Attorney General, we represent the states in the Louisiana lawsuit. Yeah. I wanted to give some reason for optimism with regard to distinguishing Bostock, because in our case, we told the court why Bostock was different, why the Section 7 holding did not control for Title IX. And we gave a number of reasons, statutory exemptions, things like that. And I'm optimistic about the case going forward with regard to Bostock being distinguishable, because the United States came back, the Department of Education came back, and it's like they hadn't even read our brief. They made some argument on completely unrelated grounds, arcane grounds regarding causation, and it really just was very, very weak. And obviously Judge Doty in the Western District agreed with us, because he kicked it right out and gave us the preliminary injunction. So far the government's efforts to say that Bostock controls, I think, have been very weak, and that, like I said, that gives me optimism for when it goes before the Supreme Court.
Will you join me in thanking our panelists? Thank you all for joining us today. Again, the event is live streamed. It will be recorded and uploaded, so please share that. We talked about public awareness today, and I think that's something that's very important. Thanks. We'll see you next time.